So in anticipation for the upcoming Remnant 2, I thought it would be a good time to go back and take a look at the original, Remnant from the Ashes. This is that Souls-like game with guns that everyone made fun of a few years ago because that description makes it sound exactly like Bloodborne, but it's actually nothing like that. Now let me tell you right now that this game is awesome, and if you haven't tried it for yourself, then you absolutely should. This is one of the most unique games to come out of the last few years, and I'm very surprised that it hasn't spawned a bunch of clones like From Software's Golden Formula has. I mean, even 4 years later, and there aren't any games remotely similar to this, whereas we get a new Souls-type game what seems like every couple months at this point. I often see the argument of, well, isn't Remnant also just another Souls-like game, but with guns? I understand how a lot of people would come to that conclusion, but that really couldn't be much further from the truth. While yes, Remnant does borrow quite a few elements from the Souls subgenre, like its approach to world building, exploration, RPG systems, and other things, and also manages to completely stand on its own with its incredible gunplay, progression, and approach to difficulty. I think this game rules. Let me tell you why. So what exactly is Remnant? Well, the easy thing to do would be to say that it's Dark Souls with guns, but that really isn't a good description of what this game is. Instead, I think it's better to describe it as a third-person shooter with procedural generation and some Souls elements. You begin by creating a character, completing a short tutorial, and picking a class. After this is when you begin the main levels, which consist of large open areas with enemies to kill, items to find, and dungeons to complete. Completing dungeons will eventually lead you to the main boss of that particular area, and after you kill it, you can then move on to the next zone. Do this enough times, and you'll eventually make your way to the final boss. There is also a story to Remnant, but I don't think it's worth having a designated section in this review for it. Basically, your character washes up on an island and realizes he needs to get to a specific location. Realizes the world is corrupted and infested with monsters that will do anything to prevent him from reaching that goal, and it's now your job to make it there by any means necessary, along with the help of some other characters that you will meet along your journey. The majority of the story in this game relies on world building and your own imagination to determine what is going on. You will also find the occasional lore entries scattered throughout the world that fleshes out more of the story and helps you understand what went down in this world, but in general the story in Remnant is very much optional and is by no means one of its strongest aspects. It's there if you want it, but you can ignore it if it's not your cup of tea. Now let's get on to what actually makes this game so good. The most standout feature of Remnant is by far its combat. Unlike every other Souls game, Remnant is a shooter first and a melee game second. Of course, ranged combat is nothing new for Souls-likes, but as far as I am aware, there isn't one that relies almost exclusively on guns for the primary form of attacking enemies like this one. So there are 3 different types of weapons that you can have equipped at all times: handguns, long guns, and melee weapons. Handguns are of course your more versatile weapon that doesn't do a lot of damage, but is great for picking off multiple lower tier enemies and finishing off higher tier ones. Long guns are your main damage dealers that you will be relying on to take down higher tier enemies and bosses. Finally, you do have a melee weapon with you at all times, really only good for picking off single enemies and acting as your last line of defense when you run out of ammo for both of your primary weapons. There is a very large number of weapons to find and use in each of these categories, ranging from more basic ones like pistols, hunting rifles, and rusty swords, to some really out there stuff like sawed-off shotguns, energy weapons, and scythes. The gunplay in Remnant is excellent. This is actually one of the best controlling shooters out there. Every weapon has just the right amount of recoil and handling that encourages precise aim and punishes you for not using a weapon for its intended purpose. Every weapon can also be equipped with a modifier that grants you a unique ability like elemental rounds, a healing aura, or even one that summons a dog to fight alongside you. These of course have a fairly long cooldown, but can really make a difference in combat. Weapons can also be upgraded using resources that you get from enemies or just find in the world, so if you come across a weapon that you really like, you can upgrade it to make it even more effective. Remnant's combat is fairly simple, as once you get the hang of it, there isn't a whole lot to master aside from experimenting with different weapons and mods. This definitely isn't as deep and complex as something like Returnal or Gears of War, and that simply isn't going to be for everyone, but I think it actually enhances the overall experience. Now, I mentioned earlier that Remnant has a lot of Souls DNA in it. Let's talk about that, starting with difficulty. So everyone knows by now that Souls-type games are notorious for their high-level difficulty compared to most other games. These types of games generally require you to master their mechanics and sometimes even look up a guide on how to beat a boss. They follow a very specific design philosophy that revolves around teaching the player through death and failure until they eventually succeed. Remnant is not like this. Remnant may have a lot of Souls DNA in it, but its difficulty is not part of that. Remnant isn't trying to break you down into submission by including bosses that the developers know are going to take most people 10, 20, or even more attempts just to beat. I think the most attempts a boss ever took me in this game was around 5 or 6. It wants you to feel challenged and in danger often, because otherwise it would be boring, but it never wants you to feel like you're just beating your head into a wall until you get something right, or like you need to go farm skill points just to beat a boss. I'm not saying that Remnant is easy though either. Even on the lowest difficulty, this game will force you to use all of the tools available at your disposal, and it will punish you for not doing so. You need to study enemy patterns and look for windows where it's safe to attack, and then know when to stop to avoid taking damage. The enemy AI is another thing that I want to highlight from this game because it is shockingly smart. The AI in this game reminds me a lot of the older Halo games because that was the first time when I noticed how good enemy AI can be. You will pick up on this very fast given how much enemies react to your every move in this game compared to a lot of other shooters where the enemies either don't move much at all or just run towards you regardless of your position. These enemies want to kill you, and they will do whatever it takes to accomplish that goal in a way that always feels fair. That to me is the most important aspect of any challenging game. I don't mind if a game is hard, as long as it feels fair, because when I mess up and die, I know it was my fault and that I can do better. But if I feel like I was cheated because an enemy pulled out some long-range hit scan attack that's basically unavoidable, that's when I have a problem, and Remnant absolutely nails this. So the question is Remnant hard? I know that's an important question for a lot of people given the Souls nature of this game, and because hearing that word is just an immediate turn-off for some. For most people, I would say no, given how easy to learn the combat is, and because every enemy attack has a very generous dodge window, as well as the inclusion of difficulty options. If you are someone that has always wanted to try a game with Souls elements but never did out of fear for them being too difficult, then I think Remnant is a fantastic starting point. But if you are someone that is easily frustrated by death and occasionally having to repeat areas of progress, then Remnant might not be for you. Progression is the other key thing that makes Remnant stand out from most of the other Souls-likes out there. So Remnant is not level-based, nor does it have a Metroidvania-type world like Dark Souls. Instead, it relies entirely on procedural generation to create the spaces that you move through. This means that the areas themselves will always have a different layout, the locations of dungeons and items will be altered, and even the locations of bosses are all randomized. Now aside from that, Remnant has some fairly standard RPG systems in place to ensure you are always getting stronger. There's a very robust skill tree that grows the further you get into the game with more stats to increase. This is where you upgrade stuff like your health, your reload speed, your stamina regeneration, and a bunch of other stuff. Unlike in Dark Souls though, you can upgrade your skills at any time rather than only being able to at a specific checkpoint. Aside from that though, the checkpoints in Remnant are very similar to those found in Dark Souls. As you explore, you will come across these glowing red crystals that represent a checkpoint. Resting at one of these will replenish all of your health and ammo, as well as save your progress, but doing this will also respawn all enemies, so you need to decide if it's worth that sacrifice. When you die, you will respawn at your last used crystal, so they work very similarly to the bonfires from Dark Souls. Next, I want to quickly talk about the presentation of Remnant. Remnant is a surprisingly great-looking game, considering the size of the studio that made it. The lighting and art style look excellent together and really help sell the world that Remnant takes place in. Sound design here is also pretty top-notch. Weapons all have a satisfying sound that helps communicate their power to you, and enemy attacks all have a fitting sound effect to go along with them. You can definitely see where cutbacks were made in this department though. Environments are generally pretty basic and lack a ton of detail, but I think it still works for what this game is going for. The facial animations in this game are also comically bad. I'll also quickly mention that performance is great for this game. I was easily able to max out all the settings and get a rock-solid frame rate while doing it. Remnant also got some post-launch support in the form of paid DLC. 2 in fact. There was Swamps of Corsus and Subject 2923. Both of these are great additions. Swamps of Courses adds a new mode called Survival, which is basically a roguelite mode where you start out with nothing and have to regain all of your gear in order to survive as long as possible. This DLC also adds a few new quests to do and some new weapons and armor to collect. The second and final DLC, called Subject 2923, is a continuation of where the base game left off. It sees you traveling to an ancient ruin with the mission to stop the source of your enemies once and for all. It's basically a mini-campaign that adds a few new zones, enemies, items, and characters. It also concludes the story with a pretty epic boss fight at the end, way better than the base game's final boss, I would say. These two DLCs definitely aren't required by any means, but they do add a nice bit of extra content. Remnant is a very good value given how much content you get for the asking price. The procedurally generated levels offer hours of replay value because every campaign will be different from the last. A large variety of weapons and skills allow for many different unique builds and playstyles. The DLCs are there if you want even more content, and there's zero microtransactions, which is sadly a rarity in a lot of releases these days. So as a whole, I think Remnant from the Ashes is a pretty great game. It combines top-tier gunplay with robust Souls-like elements and procedural generation to create a truly unique experience in the modern era of games, and revisiting it has only made me even more excited for the sequel.